At 4 o'clock in the morning on the 18th of March 2003, three large trucks pulled up outside the Central Bank of Iraq in Baghdad. The bank would not officially open for hours yet. None of that mattered. A man stepped out of the lead vehicle carrying a single handwritten letter, signed personally by the President of Iraq. His name was Qusay Hussein. He was Saddam Hussein's younger son, and the letter he carried authorized something almost impossible to comprehend in scale: the immediate withdrawal of nearly $1 billion in cash, a full quarter of his country's entire currency reserves. Within 24 hours, the United States would begin its air campaign against Baghdad. The Iraqi regime had perhaps one final night to act before the war that would ultimately destroy it began in earnest. My name is the voice behind creepy Chronicles. This is the Central Bank of Iraq robbery. By most measures, the largest cash heist in recorded history. And every fact in this investigation is confirmed contemporary journalism and official US government reporting. By March 2003, Saddam Hussein had ruled Iraq with absolute, unchallenged authority for nearly a quarter of a century. He had survived a brutal 8-year war with Iran, crushing economic sanctions imposed after his 1990 invasion of Kuwait and years of escalating international isolation. The Iraqi dinar, under his rule, had effectively become what one historical account later described as a powerful instrument of repression in its own right. A currency manipulated and mismanaged so thoroughly that it had not been genuinely tradable on international markets for years by the time the invasion began. The Central Bank of Iraq itself, originally established in 1947 as the National Bank of Iraq, had spent decades operating less as an independent monetary authority and more as a direct financial extension of whichever regime happened to control Baghdad at any given moment, a structural weakness that made the events of March 2003 almost inevitable in hindsight, given just how completely personal political control had been allowed to override any institutional independence the bank might once have aspired to. On the 17th of March, US President George W. Bush issued a final ultimatum, giving Saddam and his sons 48 hours to leave the country or face military conflict. Bush had spent over a year building the diplomatic and military case for invasion, having grouped Iraq alongside Iran and North Korea the previous year in a speech describing what he called an axis of evil, and alleging, incorrectly, as later investigations would establish, that Saddam's regime possessed active weapons of mass destruction. Saddam had no intention of leaving. Bahrain had publicly offered him asylum, and other nations, including Switzerland, would likely have accepted his family as wealthy exiles. He chose to stay, but he understood, with total clarity, exactly what was coming next, and exactly how quickly his own ability to move freely and access state resources was about to disappear once American bombs began falling. He sent his son Qusay to the central bank with one final instruction before that window closed entirely. What followed inside the bank, according to bank officials who later spoke to journalists, was almost eerily calm. There were no raised voices, no weapons drawn, no alarms triggered. Qusay arrived alongside several of Saddam's own personal bodyguards and a small group of regime officials and simply waited as bank employees began the long, methodical process of physically locating, counting and loading the requested sum. Over the following 5 hours, staff loaded stack after stack of $100 bills into metal containers, then into the waiting trucks outside. By the time they finished, the total removed came to approximately $900 million in American currency, along with a further $100 million worth of euros taken from the bank's separate foreign currency reserves, a combined total later confirmed at just over $1 billion. One unidentified Iraqi bank official later summarized the entire event to the New York Times in a single sentence that explained everything about how absolute power had operated inside Saddam's Iraq for over 2 decades. "When you get an order from Saddam Hussein," he said simply, "you do not discuss it." Some legal analysts examining the case afterward noted an uncomfortable technical wrinkle. Because Saddam Hussein, as Iraq's absolute ruler, maintained direct personal control over every state institution, including the central bank itself, the withdrawal may not have technically constituted theft under Iraqi law as it existed at the time at all. Some of the money may even have represented funds Saddam considered, in some functional sense, his own personal property, accumulated and commingled with state reserves across more than 2 decades in power. None of that ambiguity changed what happened to ordinary Iraqis in the years that followed, as their country's currency reserves, money that should have supported a population already suffering under sanctions and approaching war, instead vanished into the personal control of a single family in its final hours of power. American intelligence officials, once they learned what had happened, debated several competing theories about Qusay's true intentions. Some believed the money was meant to fund continued resistance inside Iraq once the invasion began, financing insurgent operations long after Baghdad itself fell. Others suspected it was intended to finance the regime's flight into exile, supporting Saddam, his family, and his closest loyalists wherever they ultimately ended up. Still others wondered whether the cash might eventually be smuggled across the border into Syria, disappearing from any realistic possibility of recovery, or even be deployed to directly fund attacks against the invading coalition forces themselves. None of these theories were mutually exclusive, and post-war analysts have generally concluded that the regime likely intended the funds to serve several of these purposes simultaneously, hedging against whatever specific outcome the following weeks of war actually produced for the Hussein family. The American-led invasion began the following day. Baghdad fell to coalition forces by the 9th of April 2003, just 3 weeks after the bank withdrawal, in a campaign that moved far faster than even its own planners had fully anticipated. Saddam Hussein and his 2 sons, Qusay and his older brother Uday, went into hiding as Iraqi citizens celebrated in the streets and toppled the dictator's statues across the capital. U.S. Treasury Department and Coalition Provisional Authority inspectors who reached the central bank itself in the chaotic aftermath of the invasion found the building in ruins, having suffered extensively from both direct battle damage and the widespread civilian looting that swept across Baghdad once central authority collapsed entirely. The stolen $1 billion appeared for a time to have genuinely disappeared along with the regime that took it. The first real breakthrough came on the 20th of April 2003, when soldiers from the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division conducted a routine sweep of one of Saddam's palaces outside Baghdad. One soldier noticed something subtly wrong with a section of interior wall, a hollow sound, a seam that did not quite match the surrounding structure. Behind that false wall, troops discovered row upon row of sealed metal containers. They opened 6 of them at random as an initial check. Each one contained exactly $4 million in neatly stacked banded $100 bills. A full search of the palace eventually located 164 separate containers hidden throughout the property. Some early American intelligence assessments initially attributed at least part of the hidden cash specifically to Uday Hussein, Saddam's elder son, who was independently known among Iraqi officials for personally hoarding vast quantities of cash separate from his brother's activities. The recovered cash was flown under heavy military guard to a secure location for an exhaustive bill-by-bill count. The final confirmed total came to approximately $650 million, the overwhelming majority, though not the entirety, of what had been taken from the central bank just over a month earlier. Meanwhile, the hunt continued for the men who had taken it. On the 22nd of July 2003, American forces, supported by elements of the elite 101st Airborne Division and Special Operations personnel, tracked Qusay and Uday Hussein to a villa in the northern Iraqi city of Mosul. The owner of that house, motivated significantly by a $30 million reward being offered for information leading to the brothers, had tipped off coalition forces directly. Both men died resisting capture in the firefight that followed, alongside Qusay's 14-year-old son. Saddam Hussein himself evaded capture for several more months, eventually found hiding in an underground hole near his hometown of Tikrit in December 2003. He was tried by an Iraqi tribunal for unrelated crimes, specifically the killing of 148 Shiite villagers following a 1982 assassination attempt against him, found guilty and executed in December 2006. Even after the bulk of the stolen billion was physically recovered, the story of the money itself was not quite finished. Of the roughly $650 million found inside the palace, a 2012 report from the Pentagon's own Special Inspector General's Office for Iraq Reconstruction revealed something almost as strange as the original theft. Approximately $100 million of that recovered, accounted for cash had subsequently gone missing again, this time from official U.S. custody, attributed officially to what investigators termed a records management error. To this day, no satisfying account has ever fully explained exactly how that second, smaller disappearance occurred, or precisely where that $100 million ultimately ended up. Combined with the roughly $350 million from the original theft that was never recovered at all, more than $400 million connected to a single overnight withdrawal in March 2003 remains, more than 2 decades later, permanently unaccounted for. Some later analysis has framed the entire episode as a stark, almost theatrical metaphor for the broader chaos and accountability failures that would come to define the post-invasion reconstruction of Iraq itself. Billions in international aid and reconstruction funding subsequently flowing into the country over the following years, with significant portions of that money similarly disappearing into networks of concealed assets, shell companies and unanswered questions that, in their own smaller ways, echoed the very first $1 billion that vanished the night before the war even began. Ordinary Iraqis, in the meantime, lived through the consequences of that missing reconstruction money for years afterward. Chronic shortages of electricity, clean water and basic infrastructure repair in a country whose oil wealth should, on paper, have funded recovery many times over. The central bank robbery was, in that wider sense, less an isolated anomaly than an opening chapter in a far longer story about where Iraq's money actually went during the years that followed its supposed liberation. Creepy Chronicles investigates the cases where the largest crimes are committed not in defiance of the law, but by the very people who, for a brief and terrible window, were the law itself. Every Monday, Wednesday and Friday, real, documented, told without apology. No guns were drawn at the Central Bank of Iraq on the 18th of March 2003. None were needed. When the man asking is the dictator's own son, and the order comes from the dictator himself, nobody in the room has anywhere left to refuse.